الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, ya Ikhwan, we continue with our reading from the tremendous work of Ibn Majah, Muhammad ibn Yazid al-Qazwini, rahmatullah alayhi, from Kitab al-Muqaddimah, from his Sunan. And we remain, Ikhwan, in the first narration, وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. Whatever I have commanded you with, take it. And whatever I have forbidden you, abstain from it. And we continue to read from the explanation of the noble Shaykh Abul-Hasan Malik, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala. And he says regarding this Ikhwan, جاء الأمر في هذا الحديث مطلقا امتثال الأوامر. In this particular narration, the commandment regarding obeying the commandments of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are mentioned without restriction. Without restriction. وَالْأَمَرْ مُطْلَقًا اجْتِنَابَ النَّوَاهِ. And likewise, without restriction, the commandment has come in this narration to refrain from prohibitions. ولكن جاء في بعض الروايات تقييد ذلك بالنسبة للأمر بالاستطاعة. This is an important point that the Shaykh makes here, Ikhwan. In some of the different wordings of this narration, there comes the specification of obeying the commands according to one's ability. According to one's ability. Again, in this narration, it really says, أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَخُذُوهُ. Whatever I have commanded you with, do it. So there is no restriction, not if one is able, if one has the ability to do so. This was mentioned without exception. It again is not tied to one's ability. But then he says in some of the wordings we find again the specification of obeying commands according to one's ability. And then he mentions أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Whatever I have commanded you, do of it what you are able. Do of it what you are able. وَأَمَّا النَّهْيُ فَلَمْ يَأْتِ مُقَيَّدًا بِالِاسْتِطَاعَةِ. But as for prohibitions, now again, in the other wordings it does again come with that specification of obeying commands according to one's ability, but as for the prohibitions, there is no restriction. لأن النهي ترك. He says, why does Shaykh Abul-Hasan say this is the case? He says, because the prohibition is simply leaving something off. It doesn't take ability. It doesn't take a certain ability for one to not do something. So this is different from when one is commanded to do something. Perhaps he has the ability, or perhaps he doesn't. Perhaps he can do something of it, part of it, but not the whole of it. But as for leaving something off, then one does not need the ability to just not do something. As we'll see momentarily, the Shaykh says after this, one is able to not do something, one is able to leave something off. وَلِذَلِكَ جَاءَ خَالِيًا مِنَ الْقَيْدِ. And therefore one does not find that qualification of one's ability. One does not find that qualification mentioned in the prohibition, leaving off the prohibitions. And then the Shaykh says after this, إخوان وَلَا فِيكُمْ يَسْتَطِيعَ التَّرْكَ إِذَا وَفَّقَهُ اللَّهُ. The person is able to leave off those affairs if Allah grants him success. وَجَاهَدَ نَفْسَهُ الْأَمَّارَ بِالسُّوءِ وَلَمْ يَسْتَسْلِمْ وَيَنْقَدْ لِمَا تَشْتَهِي النَّفْسِ فَإِنَّهُ يَسْتَطِيعُ أَنْ يَتْرُكَ. Allahu Akbar. So if the person struggles against himself, he fights his base desires, he fights himself, he does not give in to what his desires call him to, then he is able to leave off that thing. Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala has a tremendous statement as it relates to leaving off bad habits. Ibn Qayyim, he says that perhaps at the beginning, when one has a bad habit, whatever that bad habit may be, And one wants to abandon or leave off that bad habit. In Al-Qayyim, he says that it is only difficult, there's only some level of difficulty at the beginning. There was only some level of difficulty at the beginning of that affair, and look what Ibn Qayyim says, so that one can ascertain whether he is truthful or not as it relates to abandoning that bad habit. So it's a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see if one is truthful as it relates to leaving off that bad habit. But look what Ibn Qayyim says, but after that brief period of that somewhat difficulty, he says that the individual, that hardship will turn into that hardship will turn into pleasure. That hardship will turn into pleasure. So it will be flipped around and maybe there was something of a difficulty at the beginning of abandoning that bad habit, but by the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless them to feel good, to be happy for that which he had done, from struggling against his own soul, struggling against his own desires, and leaving off that issue. Shaykh Abul-Hasan continues. أما الأوامر فقد يكون فيها شيء من المشقة. However, as we just said, leaving off something doesn't take work. You just don't do it. He says, however, here, as for commands, then perhaps there may be involved in that some difficulty. There may be some difficulty connected to doing something. كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حفت الجنة بالمكاره. Look at the example that Shaykh Abul-Hasan brings. He brings the narration of the Messenger of Allah وسلم, that the paradise, the entering of paradise, is surrounded by hardships, difficulties. وحفت النار بالشهوات. As for the hellfire, surrounded by desires. Desires. So we see, that if, as we see in the narration, that the paradise is surrounded by those hardships, or the entering of the paradise means one has to overcome something of hardship, then that means one, Allah may have to do something difficult, a hardship. So the Shaykh Abul-Hasan, he says, so the person does it, perhaps connected to that, as we said, is some difficulty. وَفِيهَا الشَّيْء لَا يُطَاقُ وَلَا يُسْتَطَاعُ. And perhaps in that is something that the person does not have the ability to do. Perhaps connected to that, the person does not have the capacity to do so. So the person does that thing according to his ability and capacity. He does that thing according to his ability and his capacity. فالله عز وجل أمر بالصلاة قائمة. Look at the example that Shaykh Abul-Hasan he brings as well. And again, the ulama bringing these examples to further clarify these points. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to pray standing. To pray standing. لقد يعجز الإنسان عن القيام لمرض أو غيره بأن يكون مقعدا لا يستطيع القيام. The Shaykh says, so in that regard, perhaps a person, because of some sickness, some ailment, is unable to stand and pray. Is unable to pray standing. Perhaps that individual is disabled and doesn't have the ability to stand and pray. So that person fears Allah to the best of his ability. He follows that commandment to the best of his ability. فقد قال الله تعالى لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. He mentions the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Al-Baqarah, ayat number 286. Allah does not burden a soul beyond its capacity. Again, this goes back to that qualification of following a command according to one's ability. Again, in the first wording that we mentioned, that qualification is not mentioned. However, we find that qualification mentioned in other wordings of the narration, as we'll see actually in the next narration, inshallah ta'ala, in Kitab al-Muqaddimah. شباب الإخوة الله فيكم وجاء في الحديث صل قائما فإن لم تستطيع فقاعدا فإن لم تستطيع فعلى جنب. And he brings the narration, Ikhwan, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, pray standing. Command, imperative, pray standing. But if you are unable, now we see the qualification. If you are unable, then pray sitting. And if you are unable to pray sitting, then pray lying down. So clearly, Ikhwan, we see this qualification in the narration, giving an allowance to the person who was unable to stand and pray. Now we know the command comes first and foremost to stand and pray. Stand and pray. However, for one who does not have the ability, Allah does not burden a soul beyond his capacity, as we mentioned in the verse. فَالَّذِي لَا يُطِيقُ الْقِيَامَ فَلَيْسَ مَأْمُورًا بِهِ. Allahu Akbar. Shaykh Abul-Hasan says, so the one who is unable, does not have the ability, it is not upon that person to stand in that instance. And then that from the matters that we know, for example, one who is unable to fast, does not have the ability to fast, then there is a concession that is made in that person may, for example, feed a poor person. So Allah does not burden a soul beyond its capacity. We move on now to the next narration. This was a segue into the next narration, narration number 2. Also, Ikhwan, an Abi Hurairah, also on the authority of the noble companion Abu Hurairah. And we'll continue, as we mentioned in the last lesson, to discuss something of his biography and pertinent matters connected to his life. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ذروني ما تركتكم فإنما هلك من كان قبلكم بسؤالهم واختلافهم على أنبيائهم فإذا مرتكم بشيء فخذوا منه ما استطعتم وإذا نهيتكم عن شيء فانتهوا. So he mentioned the narration, Ikhwan, leave me with that which I have left you. For indeed those who were destroyed before you were destroyed because of their constant questioning of their prophets. And he says after this, Ikhwan, whatever I have commanded you with, do as much of it as you can. That qualification. And whatever I have forbidden you, abstain from it. Again, all of it. There is no qualification there in the second part of that clause. The noble scholar, Shaykh Muhammad Ibn Ali ibn Adam al-Thubi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says in the explanation of this narration. And here is what I'm reading from his explanation of the Sahih al-Imam Muslim. وقد ذكر مسلم سبب هذا الحديث من رواية محمد بن زياد. So he says, Ikhwan, that in Muslim we find the reason that the Messenger of Allah made this statement, the reason why he mentioned this narration. And I want to make a point here, Ikhwan, Shaykh Al-Albani, the great muhaddith of this asr, he said that if one knows the sabab of nuzul, if one knows the reason for the revelation of a verse in the Quran, Shaykh Al-Albani said that that person has half the knowledge of what that ayah means. When you know the context behind the revelation of a verse, and there are books that have been written, Ikhwan, regarding the issue of asbab al-nuzul, the reason for the revelation of verses. And this day, in this modern day, we have a tremendous work from Shaykh Muqbil, rahimahullah ta'ala, regarding asbab al-nuzul, the reasons for revelation. Shaykh Al-Albani, he said that if one knows the reason for the revelation of a verse, then he has half the knowledge of that verse, or the meaning of that verse. And he said, likewise, he said, we can also look at that in the context of the narrations of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we know the reason why he made a statement, then we have half the fiqh of that narration. We learn something of that narration. So here we see the importance of knowing the why. So he says that this comes in the narration of Muhammad ibn Ziyad, فقال عن أبي هريرة, again, on the authority of the noble companion Abu Hurairah, قال خطبنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال أيها الناس قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فحجوا. He says that the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم gave them a sermon. He exhorted them. And he said, O people, Allah has obligated that you make Hajj, so make Hajj. فقال رجل أكل عام يا رسول الله. So one of the people who were amongst the companions that day, he said, O Messenger of Allah, must we make Hajj every year? Must we make Hajj every year? فسكت. So the Messenger of Allah remained quiet. In another wording of the narration, it mentioned that he became angry. That he grew angry from the questioning. So after this, ikhwan, فسكت حتى قالها ثلاثا. So the companion there, ikhwan, repeated the question 3 times. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لو قلت نعم لوجبت. Had I said yes, then it would become obligatory upon you, وَلَمَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, and you would not be able to fulfill it. You would not be able to do it every year. ثُمَّ قَالْ ذَرُونِي مَا تَرَكْتُكُمْ. Leave me with that which I left you with. This is where the statement comes from. Allah has commanded you to make Hajj, so make Hajj. And the person says, wait a minute, do we have to do it every year? The Prophet remained quiet. He kept asking, every year? And so the Prophet ﷺ said, if I said yes, then it will be made obligatory upon you. So leave me with that which I left you with, until the end of the narration. Shaykh Muhammad ibn al-Ethiopi, he says that regarding this narration, before we get into the sharh of the hadith, inshallah ta'ala, he says some matters that are connected to the narration. First, it's daraja. Meaning it's grading here. And he says, هذا حديث أبي هريرة متفق عليه. It is a narration that is agreed upon by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. It's a narration that is agreed upon by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Of course, it is here collected in the Sunan Ibn Majah, but it is agreed upon by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. The highest level of authenticity as relates to the science of hadith. Those narrations that are agreed upon by the 2 noble imams of hadith, Al-Bukhari and Muslim. The second benefit, or the second matter he mentions, في بيان مواضع ذكر المصنف له, يعني the different places where the author يعني collects it, وفي من أخرجه, and also those who collect the narration besides him. And I just mentioned a couple of different places. He mentions, for example, here that Ibn Majah collected, Imam Bukhari, in Al-I'tisam, he collected Al-I'tisam, number 7,288. Perhaps the numbers may not match up exactly. However, alhamdulillah, these are the numbers that Shaykh Muhammad al-Ethiopi gives us. Different prints, the numbers may not match up. Al-Hajj, he says, Al-Hajj in Muslim. So in Al-Bukhari, Al-I'tisam, 7,288. Muslim fil Hajj. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention this, there's the reason why I wanted to mention this. I said in the first lesson that we can see the fiqh of the ulama of hadith based on their chapter headings, based on where they collect these narrations, where they place them in their books. You may find Bukhari, for example, this one. He may take a narration and put it in 3 or 4 different chapters, because that narration may have 3 or 4 different benefits connected to 3 or 4 different rulings in the issues of fiqh. So, for example, there may be a narration that talks about an issue of marriage, but there may be in that narration something dealing with tahara, for example. So he may put in the book of purification and the book of marriage at the same time, because it has multiple benefits within that one narration. And that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ coming with those comprehensive, concise and comprehensive words. So we find great benefit as it relates to these narrations. So look, Al-Bukhari collects it in Al-I'tisam. Imam Muslim, Al-Hajj. At-Tirmidhi, Fil-Ilm. Tirmidhi collects it in the book of knowledge. An-Nasa'i fil Hajj. Now, it's mentioned in Hajj, of course, because this incident took place in Hajj, and it was about Hajj. We're talking about Hajj, we should say. Of course, Kitab al-Ilm, because the Prophet ﷺ is instructing and teaching them in the affairs of the religion. So we can see how, while the ulama look at the narration and they find different benefits as it relates to it. Imam Ahmad also collects it in his Musnad, Baqi Musnad al-Mukthirin, and the narrations of the Mukthirun, as we talked about before the other day, those companions who narrate over 1,000 narrations on the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now, I said the other day that I wanted to sort of discuss the biography of Abu Hurairah a bit because it is very important. I remember some years ago, there was an individual studying at one of the Ivy League schools, Princeton University out in Jersey. And he saw himself as something of an intellectual. And we've already talked about this before, Ikhwan. An intellect that is not in accordance with the Kitab and the Sunnah, Ikhwan, is ignorance, it's foolishness, it's not intelligence. But he saw himself as something of an intellectual. And he had studied some of the thoughts of the Mustashriqun. The Mustashriqun, of course, Ikhwan, are the Orientalists. Those who study the religion of Islam with the intent purpose of trying to refute it. So this individual, Ikhwan, from the doubtful matters that he tried to, and he challenged the Muslims with that particular day, was how is Abu Hurairah, how is this one companion, Abu Hurairah, who narrated so many narrations, we mentioned the number the other day, how is this companion, Abu Hurairah, narrating so many narrations, and he only spent a few years, a few small years, he says, a few short years, with the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but yet he narrates all of these other narrations, and some of the other companions with him much longer, and they didn't narrate that many narrations. Again, he was trying to place doubt in the carrier of the Sunnah. Why? Because if you can place doubt in the carrier, then you can place doubt in that which he carries. And this is what we find in some of the works, and there are many works that have been written in defense of Abu Hurairah, Difa' and Abi Hurairah, radiallahu anhu. And again, Ikhwan, the reason why this is so important is because if they were able to cast doubts on the likes of Abu Hurairah, that as we said before, how many narrations of the Messenger of Allah Ikhwan, would be obliterated. So alhamdulillah, Ikhwan, we were able to refute his falsehood and that which he came with from the Orientalists, walillah alhamd. And I wanted to read today partially from the biography of Abu Hurairah so as to help clarify and explain how he was able to narrate so many narrations over a shorter period of time than others. And this is by the testimony of the Messenger of Allah himself, by the testimony of Abu Hurairah himself, and by the testimony of the other companions who were around Abu Hurairah. So let us examine, Ikhwan, what we find as it relates to this. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قلت يا رسول الله إني سمعت منك كثيرا فأنساه قال ابسط رداءك فبسطت فغرف بيدي فيه ثم قال فضممته فما نسيت حديثا بعد. Now this, Ikhwan, again, is a tremendous narration. Abu Hurairah said, I said to the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, indeed I hear from you many narrations, but I forget them. Now, this is early on in the affair. I hear many narrations, but I forget them. This is Abu Hurairah, Hafiz al-Sahaba, the memorizer of the companions. And early on he said he had an issue memorizing. So the Prophet ﷺ said to him, spread out your lidah, your upper garment, the part of the garment that covers your upper body. Spread it out. So he said, so I spread it out, and the Messenger of Allah ﷺ began to move his hands over the garment as if he was scooping something into it. As if he was scooping something into it, motioning in this way. And then he said, wrap it up. He told Abu Hurairah, wrap it up. Abu Hurairah said, I wrapped it up, and afterwards I never forgot a hadith. After this, I never forgot a hadith. So this shows us, Ikhwan, that this ability, part of this ability to memorize in this fashion came by way of this supplication and this action of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Tremendous narration. Next. عن أبي هريرة أنه قال قيل يا رسول الله من أسعد الناس بشفاعتك يوم القيامة قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لقد ظننت يا أبا هريرة ألا يسألني عن هذا الحديث أحد أول منك بما رأيت من حرصك على الحديث. Abu Hurairah Ikhwan mentioned that a person, one of the people, said to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who will be most deserving of your intercession on Yawm al-Qiyamah? The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before answering the question, so the question comes, who is the most deserving of your intercession? Incredible question. The question of Aqidah, question of belief. Before answering the question, the Prophet ﷺ turned to Abu Hurairah and he said, "O Abu Hurairah, I did not think that anyone would ask me that question before you because of what I have seen from your desire to learn hadith." So this shows again that Abu Hurairah has such a great desire, such a great diligence in learning the hadith and learning the sunnah, that the Prophet didn't even think somebody would ask a question like that before him. So again, this shows the history. This is why we go back and we have to read the history. We have to read the biographies of the noble companions so as to understand the context, and we can defend them in the instances where the likes of the Orientalists tried to defame them. After mentioning this, Ikhwan, he said, the one who will be most deserving like this of my intercession on Yawm al-Qiyamah is the one who says, La ilaha illallah khalisan min qalbihi aw nafsihi. The one who sincerely says from his heart, he says that nothing or no one has the right to be worshipped besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there we find, Ikhwan, again, the great desire of Abu Hurairah. First we find Prophet ﷺ motioning, as we said, over the garment of Abu Hurairah to aid him in his memorization. Then we find the great desire of Abu Hurairah from the testimony of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is from his testimony as it relates to Abu Hurairah's great desire to learn hadith. Next, Ikhwan, ما رواه أحمد عن أبي بن كعب. ما رواه أحمد عن أبي بن كعب. Now we mentioned Ubay ibn Ka'b the other day from the great memorizers and reciters, scribes of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ubay ibn Ka'b, he said, أن أبا هريرة كان جريئا على أن يسأل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أشياء لا يسأله عنها غيره. Again, we said we was also mentioned in the testimony of the companions. Ubay ibn Ka'b said that Abu Hurairah had the courage to ask the Messenger of Allah ﷺ questions that no one else would ask. He had the courage to ask questions of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ that no one else would ask. That goes back to what we heard from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. I didn't think anybody would ask that question before you. Because Abu Hurairah was constantly asking questions, constantly trying to learn the Sunnah, constantly trying to benefit in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is by the testimony of the noble companion Ubay ibn Ka'b. Also, Ali ibn Umar, we find in the narration of Abdullah ibn Umar, أنه قال لأبي هريرة يا أبا هريرة أنت كنت ألزمنا لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأحفظنا لحديثه. Abdullah ibn Umar said to Abu Hurairah, he said, "Oh Abu Hurairah, you stayed closest to the Messenger of Allah ﷺ out of all of us. You stayed closest to the Messenger of Allah ﷺ out of all of us, and you memorized his hadith more than any of us. And you memorize his hadith more than any of us." So when somebody comes and tries to question the number of narrations that Abu Hurairah reported, we say, wait a minute, go back to the Sunnah. Go back to the statement of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Go back to Abu Hurairah's statement, and we'll see more from Abu Hurairah momentarily, inshallah ta'ala. Go back to the testimony of those other companions that you were talking about, who spent many years with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They'll tell you that they will tell you that Abu Hurairah clung to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, constantly walking with him, benefiting from him. And here we see Abdullah ibn Umar, the one who we know strove to follow the Sunnah in great detail. In great detail. And you memorize the hadith more than any of us, he said. And Mubarak Fori, in his explanation of At-Tirmidhi, Tuhfat al-Ahwadi, he says regarding this narration, كنت ألزمنا لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أي كنت أكثرنا لزوما له You clung to him, you clung closer to him than any of us, as what is intended there. وَحْفَظْنَا لِحَدِيثِهِ أي أكثر وأقوى حفظا لحديثه منا. Not only did you narrate more than us, or like this, or memorize more than us, your memory was stronger than ours. That goes back to what? That garment that was spread out. Part of that is that garment that was spread out, and the Prophet ﷺ doing that scooping motion into that garment for Abu Hurairah to memorize the narration. So his memory was stronger than anybody else's. Allah people. And here we see by the testimony of the likes of Abdullah ibn Umar. Next one, عن طلحة ibn Ubaydillah. Who was Talha ibn Ubaydillah? He's from the 10 companions promised paradise in the narration. He said, لا أشك أن أبا هريرة سمع من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما لم نسمع. He said, I have no doubt whatsoever that Abu Hurairah heard from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ that which we did not hear. I know that it's from the companions, 10 companions promised paradise. We already mentioned Ubay ibn Ka'b, we mentioned Abdullah ibn Umar. Now we mentioned Ikhwan ibn Fikum, Talha ibn Ubaydullah. When he mentions Allah ibn Fikum, I have no doubt that Abu Hurairah memorized or heard from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ that which we did not hear. قال الحافظ ابن حجر, he says, regarding the period in which Abu Hurairah companioned the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, because this is a point of contention from these individuals. We said earlier, they said, well, he's only with the Prophet a few numbers, a few years. And then, of course, they use this, as we said, a point of contention. So Ibn Hajar, he says in Fath al-Bari, قدم في خيبر سنة 7, that he arrived during Khaybar in the year 7. وكانت خيبر في الصفر, and Khaybar was in Safar, the month of Safar, يعني month 2. ومات النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في الربيع الأول, and the Prophet ﷺ died in month 3, Rabi' al-Awwal, month 3, سنة 11, and he died in the 11th year of the Hijrah. So that would mean that Abu Hurairah companioned him for a period of 4 years and 1 month. 4 years and 1 month. Now, as we said before, these individuals, they give a different number. Sometimes they say 3 years or like this, and we'll explain why. We'll give the explanation as to why perhaps there's a discrepancy in the numbers. But certainly we say he came, as we said, during Khaybar, in the 7th year, month of Safar. And Allah Fikum, Prophet ﷺ died in the Rabi' al-Awwal in the 11th year, so about 4 years and 1 month that he companioned him. And by the way, when Mother Imam al-Faz said, when the people of innovation challenge us with weak narrations and like this, we respond with the Tariq. We come back with the history. And likewise, when these individuals try to make these statements regarding the likes of Abu Hurairah, we come back with the dates. So Ibn Hajar, he says, Al-Mudda Arba'a Sinin wa Ziyada. He says 4 years and some change. We already mentioned 4 years and a month. وبذلك جزم حميد بن عبد الرحمن الحميري. حميد بن عبد الرحمن الحميري. And the ulama said regarding him, he's أفقه أهل البصرة. That he is from the most knowledgeable of the people of Basra. Who was Humayd ibn Abdul Rahman al-Himyari? The other night I said I was going to bring this name up. Mu'adh, naam.
The one with Yahya bin Ya'mar, Abdullah bin Umar.
Ahsant. He is the one who was the companion of Yahya bin Ya'mar. And the narration that we mentioned, so the first narration in the Sahih of Imam Muslim, in Kitab al-Iman, in the book of faith, first narration. Remember we talked about Ibn Umar refuting those people who deny the divine decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, the two companions, or the two tabi'een, but they were companions, meaning they were travel companions and companions, friends, that they traveled together. It was, as we said, Yahya ibn A'mar and Humayd ibn Rahman al-Himyari. So this was his position, again, mentioning this 4 years and was ziyada, 4 years and change, as we said, 4 years and 1 month. So how do we reconcile that with another narration? So he says, وَأَمَّا إِخْبَارُ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ أَنَّهُ صَحِبَ النَّبِيَّ صلى الله عليه وسلم 3 سنين. Because we have narrations where Abu Hurairah says that he accompanied the Prophet ﷺ for 3 years. He said 3 years. So here's where the point of discrepancy comes in. So they say, well, he was on with the Prophet for 3 years. كما وقع في الصحيح البخاري. So that narration about 3 years comes in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. Number 3591. أنه قال صحبت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 3 سنين. He says, I companioned the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم for 3 years. لم أكن في السن أحرص على أن أعي الحديث مني فيهن. He said, those 3 years during which I was never more concerned about understanding the Prophet's traditions than at that time. That like no other time was I concerned about learning, more desirous about learning the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah than during those 3 years. So how do we understand this? How do we understand this based on the 4 years and 1 month in the narration in Bukhari where Abu Hurairah says 3 years? But Ibn Hajar, alhamdulillah, from the ulama, he clarifies and explains that perceived discrepancy. He says, فكأن أبا هريرة اعتبر المدة التي لازم فيها النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ملازمة شديدة فذلك بعد قدومهم من خيبر. So he says, it is as if Abu Hurairah recognized the period in which he most closely companioned the Messenger of Allah. So he was with them for the 4 years and 1 month. However, he was only recognizing the 3 years because that was the period which he was most close to the Messenger of Allah. So you can be with somebody, for example, be around them for 4 years, but you say, but I was really with him for 3 years. I met him in, for example, 2007. And then, I was around him 2007, 2008, but then from 2009 to 2013, I was with him every day. So the period of being with him was still 4 years. But that period of that close companionship where you're with him every day or like this, he's saying was a period of 3 years. So in that, Ikhwan explains what, as we said, Ikhwan, the apparent discrepancy. And then Ibn Hajar, he goes on, Ikhwan, and perhaps brings other possibilities. أو لم يعتبر الأوقات التي وقع فيها السفر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من غزوة وحجه وعمره. And he says, and also perhaps he wasn't counting the time when the Prophet ﷺ traveled. Perhaps he was subtracting from that 4 years the time when the Messenger of Allah ﷺ traveled either for expeditions or for Hajj or for Umrah. He says, لأن ملازمته له فيها لم تكن كملازمته له في المدينة. Because during the travels, he wasn't with him in that same fashion as he was in Medina. So perhaps he was not counting that period as well. Next, Ikhwan, after mentioning that, and Ibn Hajar clarifying those points, عن أبي هريرة قال إن الناس يقولون أكثر أبو هريرة. Now here we see Abu Hurairah himself dealing with this issue of people saying that he narrated a lot. So again, not only do we have the testimony of Abu Hurairah as it relates to his memorization, his memory. We have the statement or the action of the Messenger of Allah. We have the statement of Allah regarding no one didn't think anyone would ask a question before him. We have the testimony of the noble companions regarding Abu Hurairah. And now we see at one of the few that Abu Hurairah himself says that the people say Abu Hurairah has narrated abundantly. So he's dealing with the issue himself in his time. These Orientalists don't mention this. They don't mention this. He says, لولا آيتان في كتاب الله ما حدثت حديثا. He said, if it were not for two verses in the Quran, I would not have narrated a narration. And he mentioned from the إن الذين يكتمون ما أنزلنا من البينات الهدى إلى قوله الرحيم. And he mentioned the verse in the Quran, and indeed those who withhold knowledge that has been revealed from the clarification and the guidance, those who withhold knowledge. Abu Hurairah, of course, is saying here that he would not be from those who withheld knowledge. Every people. And then he said, Ikhwan, after this, إن إخواننا من المهاجرين كان يشغلهم الصف بالأسواق وإن إخواننا من الأنصار كان يشغلهم العمل في أموالهم وإن أبا هريرة كان يلزم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بشبع بطنه ويحضر ما لا يحضرون ويحفظ ما لا يحفظون. الله أكبر. Now this also explains why he would be able to memorize and narrate more narrations than those who perhaps were with the Messenger of Allah for a longer period of time. This narration clarifies this. He says, indeed, my brothers, our brothers from the Muhajirin, they were busy with their business dealings, and he says, as-saf, and I'll mention it momentarily what is intended there, as-saf, as-swaq. They were busy with their business dealings. They had to take care of business. They had to do their buying and their selling and selling their wares and goods until the end of that. And he says, as for our brothers from the Ansar, then they too were also busy with their properties and what have you, dealing with their properties and other than this. But as for Abu Hurairah, he says, and he, meaning himself, come to the Masjid of Allah content with enough to fill his stomach. Content with enough that would fill his stomach. And I was present when they weren't present. So during that period, when the others were busy, they had to work and had to take care of their families, they had to sell their wares and their goods, Abu Hurairah was there. With just enough food to fill his stomach, clinging to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So he says, I was present when they weren't, and I memorized what they had not. So again, when all of this clarifies the great station, the great position of Abu Hurairah and defends him from those baseless claims that are made regarding him in Quran, of him narrating more narrations in a shorter period of time than other companions. And by the way, Quran, the meaning of a saf in the narration, as Ibn Hajar, Allah Ibn Hajar, he mentioned a saf, he says, it's like this. You know, when you do a business deal and you shake hands on the business deal, but you kind of clap like that. He says that's what is intended in the narration. Allah that when you complete a business deal, you do that. So he used that term, saf, like the hand clap, for the business deal itself. It's a very, I thought a very beneficial point as it relates to the narration. As for the explanation of this narration, we'll look at a portion of it, inshallah ta'ala. Now. And we're reading now with Shaykh Abul-Hasan Al-Abbad, حفظه الله تعالى. إذن هذا الحديث فيه تقييد الأمر بالاستطاعة. This narration has the qualification, we mentioned that earlier, of one's ability, one's capacity, capability to perform the action. As we said, the first narration didn't have that qualification. It simply said, whatever I have given you, take it. Whatever I have commanded you, do it. But insan yastati' al-tark. It goes back to the point we mentioned previously that a person is able to leave something off. وَقَدْ يَسْتَطِيعُ الْفِعْلِ وَقَدْ لَا يَسْتَطِيعُهُ. It says a person, perhaps, maybe they have the ability to perform something and maybe they don't. Maybe they have the ability to perform something and maybe they don't. فَهُوَ مَأْمُورٌ بِالتَّرْكِ وَالِاجْتِنَابِ الْمُحَرَّمَاتِ. So he has been commanded, or the command is to refrain from prohibited things altogether. To refrain from prohibited things يعني مطلقة altogether. وأما بالنسبة للأوامر فهو مأمور بفعل ما يستطيع. But as for commands, then one is commanded to do from them what he is able. على حسب الطاقة والقدرة, according to ability and capability. And then he mentions the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah does not burden a soul beyond its capacity. فحديث أبي هريرة الثاني مقيد للحديث الأول المطلق. Now, this is a nice point. The first narration is general, and this narration, the second narration, qualifies the first narration. Is a qualifier for the first narration. So it gives it that specification of ability. So this is what we said the other day, Ikhwan. We said that Shaykh Abul-Hasan, he mentions that one must bring together the different wordings of the narration so as to get a fuller picture, a better understanding of these affairs. Shaykh Abul-Hasan, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned one of the importance of looking at the different texts, the different nusus, so that one can have a fuller picture of any matter, any issue. And he mentioned this Ikhwan in his recording al-Hiwar ma'a Jama'at al-Takfir, a reputation of the people of Takfir. And in this Ikhwan, he said that the problem with the people of Takfir, these Khawarij of today and of old, is that they take one evidence. They look at one evidence. They don't think about the other evidences that Ikhwan are taking them in totality, negotiating the narration, reconciling between the narration. So you get a fuller understanding of any matter. They take this one particular narration, they take it and they go with it, ignoring everything else that may be mentioned in that regard. But as for Ahl-Sunnah looks at the totality of the nusus, all of the different evidences and proofs, and understands and reconciles and negotiates between that which we find in those texts. So here we see in the first, the commands and leave of to do what you have been commanded to do without that qualifier. But what if a person doesn't have the ability to do so? So now we see, well, here's the narration that clarifies that and explains that from the Sunnah. So he said, so if it is said, for example, and look at this example that Shaykh Abul-Hasan brings. If someone says, somebody tells you, carry that boulder. Go over there, pick up that boulder and carry that boulder. قد يستطيع وقد لا يستطيع. Depending on the person's strength, maybe there is someone who can pick it up and carry it. But somebody else may not have the ability to pick it up and carry it, because that is an action that takes a certain effort that one has to do. لكن لو قيل له لا تدخل هذا الباب. But if somebody says to you, hey, look, don't go in that door, does it take any effort to not go in the door? It takes no effort. So picking up a boulder takes a certain level of strength, a certain level of ability to pick it up and carry it. That takes a certain ability. But if you're sitting in your car and somebody tells you don't go in that door, you just sit in your car. Just don't get up. Just don't do anything. So that is why we have the qualifier as it relates to a command, do of it what you are able, because perhaps there is someone who does not have the ability to perform that action, as opposed to the prohibitions, which does not take any effort whatsoever. You just don't do it. So the Shaykh, he says, so again, so the person is able to not enter because it is just leaving something off. And by the way, if I'm giving those kinds of examples, those kind of concrete examples, this is from the Sunnah. This is from the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen, he mentions this in his explanation of the 40 hadith of An-Nawawi. He says that the Prophet ﷺ, from his teaching methodology, is that he would give concrete examples for people to understand sort of abstract notions, these high notions, for example, give you something that you can see with your eyes. So, for example, regarding the person who remains away from the jama'ah, the prayer of the jama'ah, what was the example that the Prophet ﷺ gave regarding that? It's like the lone sheep. What happens to the lone sheep? The wolf gets it. It's swallowed by the wolf. Look, that's something you can see, you can perceive that. That's perceptible. So therefore, when you hear that kind of explanation for that issue, for that matter, you say, it becomes clear. Look at the teaching style, the teaching methodology of the Messenger of Allah. So Shaykh Abul-Hasan Malik gives us an example of carrying a boulder or not going in the door. This is to make it easier for us to understand it. Look at the beauty of the religion of Islam. Prophet ﷺ said in the desert there's a tree that the believers like that tree, that plant, that doesn't shed its leaves, the end of that. And in Ibn Umar, he said that it came to my mind that it was the date palm tree. But I didn't say anything because I was the youngest of the people. As Imam al-Bukhari collects in the Sahih Kitab al-Ilm, in the book of knowledge. I didn't say anything because I was the youngest of the people. Again, look at the adab, look at the etiquette. Even if he had the answer, the correct answer, he wasn't about to jump out there before those who were older than him, his elders in that regard. And what did Umar say? He said, if he would have said it, he would have gave that answer, I would have been happy, or he mentioned the great joy he would have had. Ibn Umar had mentioned that this shows the love that a parent has for his child. So he mentions after this, Shaykh Abul-Hasan, وقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ذلوني ما تركتكم, leave me with that which I left you with. المقصود منه أن الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام إذا أمر الناس بأمر أو نهاهم عن نهي فإنهم يستسلمون وينقادون ولا يسألون الأسئلة التي يترتب عليها مضر لهم. So he said, this means that when the Messenger of Allah commands with something or prohibits something, then the people must submit to it. And don't start asking questions that will result in a hardship or a harm for the people. كان يسألوا عن شيء في زمن التشريع. For example, asking about something during the time of the legislation. The revelation was being revealed during the time of the legislation. فيفرض وعليهم فيه مشقة. And that thing would be made obligatory upon them, and they will find a difficulty in it. So the Prophet is saying, if I give you a command, take it. And don't ask the kinds of questions that will cause a greater harm or hardship upon you. Like, do we have to make Hajj every year? For example, right? And there's the narration. ويبين هذا ما جاء في بعض الروايات. And he said, what clarifies this, what has come in some of the different narrations, some of the different wordings of the narration. And he said, أيها الناس, as we mentioned before, the word, قد فرض الله عليكم الحج فحجوا. Allah has obligated the Hajj upon you, so make Hajj. فقال رجل كل عام يا رسول الله فسكت حتى قالها ثلاثة. Do we have to make it every year? Someone asked, and he remained quiet until the man said it 3 times. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, as you mentioned in the narration previously, if I said yes, then it would be made obligatory and you would not be able to fulfill it. فغضب لهذا السؤال. Now Shaykh Abul-Hasan mentions, we said there is another wording that mentions he became angry at this line of questioning. لأنه من الأسئلة التي ينبغي ألا تطرح, because it was the kind of question that should not be asked. فهذا فيه تكلف, because in this Ikhwan is placing a great responsibility upon the people. In this kind of questioning is that which will place a great responsibility upon the people. فمن الذي يستطيع أن يحج كل سنة? Shaykh Abul-Hasan asked a very important question here. Who is able to make Hajj every year? How many of the people would be able to make Hajj every year? فهل يحج الناس كل سنة ويتركون بلادهم? Will the people be able to make Hajj every year, leaving their land, leaving their families, their homes like this every year from the different corners of the earth? Even for some, even once in a lifetime is a difficult affair. May Allah make it easy for us to make Hajj to His house. ثم قال, and then he mentions, Shaykh Abul-Hasan says, then he says, leave me with that which I left you with, for indeed that which destroyed those who came before you was their constant questioning and their differing with their prophets. مثل ما حصل لبني إسرائيل في البقرة, as happened with the children of Israel regarding the cow. البقرة. أمروا بذبحها. They were commanded to sacrifice the cow. فتكلفوا وتعمقوا بالأسئلة. So they started going deep, asking questions. Well, what does it look like? What color is it? So they started asking all of these different questions. Until in the end, he says, في النهاية إلى بقرة لها أوصاف معينة. Until the end, it came with a cow with very specific details, very specific characteristics. Of course, difficult to find. وكان بإمكانهم أن يذبحوا أي بقرة. And in the beginning, they could have sacrificed any cow. Could have been easy on themselves. They could have sacrificed any cow. They were just commanded to sacrifice a cow. But because of their constant questioning, and their differing, they had to find a specific cow that met those particular descriptions. ويتحقق بها المقصود ولكنهم شددوا فشدد عليهم. They could have, as we said, sacrificed any cow, and they could have fulfilled what was intended there. Could have done what was intended for them to sacrifice a cow. However, shaddadu, they were stern and harsh as it relates to the kind of cow, the questioning about the cow. فشدد عليهم. So they were treated harshly. فنهى الرسول عن ذلك. So the Messenger of Allah has prohibited that. He has prohibited that. وبين أن الأمة السابقة هلكت بمثل هذا المسلك. And he explained that the previous nations were destroyed because of this very kind of behavior, because of this very activity. ثم قال إذا مرتكم بشيء فخذوا منه ما استطعتم. And then he said, whatever I have commanded you, do of it what you can. وإذا نهيتكم عن شيء فانتهوا. And if I have forbidden you from something, abstain from it. Shaykh Abul-Hasan says, ومع ذلك لما أمر الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم بالحج وقال إن الله إن الله كتب عليكم الحج فحجوا. So he says, and with that, the Messenger of Allah commanded with making Hajj, and he said, indeed Allah has obligated the Hajj upon you, so make Hajj. فالواجب يتحقق بمرة. So it is obligatory to be done once. وما زاد عليها فهو تطوع. And whoever does more than the one time for making Hajj, it is supererogatory. It is a supererogatory Hajj, meaning an extra Hajj. We'll read some of the benefits of the narration from Shaykh Muhammad al-Ethiopian, and then we'll end, inshallah. The first benefit Shaykh Muhammad al-Ethiopian he mentioned regarding this narration, ما ترجم له المصنف رحمه الله هو بيان وجوب اتباع سنته. The first benefit is what the author brought as a chapter heading, and that is the clarification of the obligation of following the Prophet's Sunnah. Clarification of the obligation of following, adhering to the Prophet's Sunnah. First benefit. Second benefit. ما قاله النووي رحمه الله تعالى هذا من جوامع الكلم. As we said before, this is from the concise yet comprehensive words of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the statement of Nawawi. This is from the concise yet comprehensive words of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وقواعد Islam, and from the fundamental principles of Islam, from the foundational principles of Islam. And we said this goes back to the Shahadatain, the testimony that nothing has the right to be worshipped except for Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. And he said, وَيَدْخُلُ فِيهِ كَثِيرُ الْأَحْكَامِ كَالصَّلَاةِ لِمَنْ عَجَزَ عَنْ رُكْنٍ مِنْهَا. And then he says, and included in this are many affairs of fiqh, many affairs of fiqh in the religion, like prayer, for example. But the one who was unable to perform one of the pillars of the prayer, al-shart, or one of the conditions of the prayer, the yasik al-maqdur, he does what he is able to do from the prayer. So if he can't stand and pray, he sits and pray and does what he can. So he still does the bowing or and the likes of this. So he does what he can from the prayer, Allah yabarik, and he is excused in that which he is unable to do. وَالْكَذَا الْوُضُوء. And other than that, Ikhwan, he mentions from several other points, whether it be fasting in the month of Ramadan, لِمَنْ أَفْطَرَ بِالْعُذْرِ, for the one who breaks his fast because of an excuse that he has. Then all of these affairs that we said, Ikhwan, then the person does what he can and he does not leave off that which he has the ability to do. So if he has the ability to do something, he has to do that which he has the ability to do. You can't now say, okay, well, I don't have the ability to pray standing, so I'm not going to pray. That is not what's understood, ya Ikhwan. فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, do as much of it as you can. The very wording explains for us that you have to do something of that which you have the ability to do. So your excuse that you can't stand pray, or you can't pray standing, is not an excuse not to pray. It is simply an excuse not to pray standing, as we see in the narration that one can pray sitting or lying down. Third benefit. أنه استدل به على أن من أمر بشيء فعجز عن بعضه ففعل المقدور أنه يسقط عنه ما عجز عنه. We just mentioned that previously, that this narration is used as an evidence for the one who is commanded to do something is unable to do part of it, and he does what he is able to do. And as we said, whatever he does that he is able to do, the rest of it is, he is pardoned. He is pardoned for that which remains. He is pardoned from that which remains from that matter. Now, and the next benefit, Ikhwan, I'm trying to go through, I don't have a lot of time. And the next benefit, Ikhwan, he mentions that the people use this as an evidence على أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يجتهد في الأحكام لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لو قلت نعم لوجبت. We see here the Prophet ﷺ, Ikhwan, كان يجتهد, that he would look into the affairs and arrive at the proper understanding. And that can be found in his statement, if I said yes, it will be made obligatory upon you. وأجاب من منع احتمال أن يكون أوحي إليه ذلك في الحال. And he said that, again, understanding that perhaps if he made that statement, then revelation would be sent to him, would be given to him at that moment, obligating the ummah to make hajj every year. The next benefit, Ikhwan, and we'll end on this last benefit, inshallah ta'ala. Or two benefits, two short benefits, inshallah ta'ala. That this is used as an evidence على أن جميع الأشياء على الإباحة حتى يثبت المنع من قبل الشارع. And they use this as an evidence that things in their origin are permissible, in general, are permissible in the worldly life, permissible, unless there comes some prohibition in the Shara. Unless there comes some prohibition in the Shara and the Islamic legislation. And finally, the last benefit that we'll read there, again, there's much more here, but for time's sake, we abridge or summarize a bit. That it is used as an evidence على النهي عن كثرة المسائل وتعمق في ذلك. And in this narration, we find the prohibition of asking excessive questions, excessively asking questions, and diving too deeply into matters. And that is actually the end of the explanation of the second narration, which would bring us to the next narration, but we'll end here. Jazakumullahu khairan. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your patience this morning. And we hope to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we benefit from that which we heard from these narrations, these texts, and the statements of the ulama clarifying their meanings. Jazakumullahu khairan. Yeah.
You mentioned about, loss of smoking, whatever. I don't know if you remember. I don't recall if you gave the reference.
I didn't mention the reference.
I thought I did.
The hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari, in Kitab al-Ilm, in the book of knowledge, Bab Hifz al-Ilm, in the chapter, the memorization of knowledge, number 119. Number 119. Wa yakum. Nah.
What was the ayah that Abu Hurairah said that he would have not narrated anything for this ayah?
Lahda. Let me write this, put this note here. Kitab al-Ilm, Bab Hifz al-Ilm. Naam. So it's in the chapter, it's in the book of knowledge, in the chapter, the preservation of knowledge. Wa yakum. And I said number 119. $119.